While the youth are going, let me just say it is so good to be back with you. My name is Philip, and I'm just honored to be here with you, sincerely, here in Modesto, where the weather can't make up its mind. What weather is today? Who knows? Who knows? Is it? No, I'm so glad to be here, and I'm really honored to be speaking in your series that you are going through on the Sermon on the Mount. And you guys might be noticing, if you're tracking at home, that you are, after today, will be 12 verses in 4 weeks, which feels like a bad pace to be going at, right? For a sermon that takes 10 minutes to read. For a message that if you listen to the Bible on the Bible app and you use the British guy reading to you like I do, 14 minutes of British guy reading to you. Yet, you're 4 weeks in. It's going to be a 23-week series. I heard there's going to be breaks. But the reason this matters is because this message, Jesus teaches kind of about everything, right? We actually did, at the church I was working at prior, we did a series on this message called The Day God Talked About Everything. Because he does. And it's amazing. And in this short span, Jesus gives so much wisdom and so much rich information about what he is all about, because this is the manifesto of the kingdom of God. Jesus said that is why he came, was to establish the kingdom. And his thesis paragraph are these things you guys have been going through called the Beatitudes. In your Bible, it's 12 verses of blessed are thee. So we got to know, what does it mean to be blessed? What does it mean to be blessed? Sometimes when we think of being blessed, we think of the blessings in our life, and I think you are correct to do that. For me, this week, I had a pretty awesome experience with my daughter. My daughter is 6. She is about to be 7. My kids' birthdays are on the same day, 3 years apart, and they're in 2 weeks from now. So this is me reminding myself if I watch this back to make sure they get gifts. It's one day. I should be able to remember. Anyways, so part of my daughter's gift was she wants to be a Kings fan, Sacramento Kings fan. If you're a basketball person, okay. I'm not a Kings fan. But here's the deal. I'm not a Kings fan, but I'm going to let her pick. Someone in kindergarten, one of her friends was a Kings fan. Boom, she's a Kings fan. She is in first grade, and the Kings have this thing. It's like light the beam when they win their, whatever amount of games they win a year. They light this giant purple beam into the sky, and we could see it from our house. So it's pretty Sacramento is pretty contagious around the Kings. So she wants to be a Kings fan, so I got to take her on Monday. And it rocked. It was so fun. She was screaming so loud. She was so hyped. She doesn't know any players' names. I had to remind her who they were playing 7 times. It was a blast. They played the Hornets, and the Kings won by 42. Couldn't have picked a better game. And then they got to light the beam in the room. And I got home that night and put her to bed, and I sat on my couch, and I'm like, man, life is good. Do you know what I don't do, though? I don't go home after a really hard day and sit on my couch and go, man, life is good. After a rough day at work, do you know what I get home and do? I don't even think about the day. I try to avoid it, but if I can't avoid it, I just get home and I vent to my wife and stress her out, and then I'm fine. She's stressed, but I'm fine, But here's the thing. These Beatitudes, these blessed statements, this is Jesus saying the good life is different than you thought. And you've walked through them the last 2 weeks, and we're entering the last 3, the last triad of these good life statements, this unexpected descriptor of the good life. And this is what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 9. He says this: blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And today what we're going to find, this is our main idea for the day. So if you wanted to write one thing down and then call it, this is what you're going to write down. When we enter arenas of conflict as peacemakers, we are investing in the new creation reality of the kingdom. And you're looking at me like, what kind of philosophy, theory, weird theological thing did you just put out there? I promise we'll get to it. But when we enter arenas of conflict as peacemakers, we're investing in the new creation reality of the kingdom. Today, I want to talk to you about the difficult path of the kingdom And it starts by being a peacemaker. Once again, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Now, we have to remember that we are here in Modesto, California in 2025, and Jesus is speaking in the Middle East in the first century. So sometimes it's really hard for us to connect what he's saying to his reality because we naturally connect it to ours, right? So like when I say peace, you might be thinking of like, I don't know, like the hippie movement or throwing up a peace sign or something like that. Like, what is peace, right? But for Jesus' audience, it's a little different. We use peace like just the absence of conflict, right? Like, think about presidents. They're defined as either a wartime president or a peacetime president. Like, that is one of the descriptors of their time in office. But that's not what the Hebrew concept of peace is all about. Jesus here is describing something different. The Hebrew word is shalom, and you might have heard that before, but it's not the absence of conflict or trouble, but it is actually the presence of harmony. It's not something that's removed, it's something that's introduced. Rabbis from around this time said that peace represents everything which makes for a person's highest good. So it's not something you take away, conflict. It's not something that's removed. It's something that's added to in the positive. So peace isn't just about keeping the peace. And that is what we would rather do because keeping the peace can be easy, right? But that's not what this is all about. So when we think about peacemaking, Tim Mackey from the Bible Project says that peacemaking is entering into conflicts and working creatively to open up a just and generous path forward for others. It's us walking in spaces of conflict and using our influence and resources to create harmony, to create a just and generous path forward for others. And this is actually the only use of this word peacemaker in the Bible. Generally, when you're studying the Bible, you want to find where else this concept is. And then I did, and I was like, okay, Jesus just made up a word. Literally, he made up a word to describe this. But the idea, the concept of being a peacemaker is prevalent in both testaments. Psalm 34:14, for example, says, "Turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it." Likewise, Romans 14:9 says, "Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification." So again, this is doing active good. Both of these verses talk about doing good, making every effort to bring about peace, because peacemaking is not peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is not talking about politics at Thanksgiving. Peacekeeping is avoiding that person at work. And you're picturing a person. That's okay. We all have one. I don't, of course, but you guys do. You guys should ask the staff of your church who their person is. I'm kidding. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. It's bad. I'm a guest speaker. I stir up chaos and walk away. When I think about this, it's not tolerance, right? Like, our culture teaches tolerance, right? And we should be accepting of diversity, but we don't have to tolerate everything, okay? Because tolerating everything is just peacekeeping. When I think about peacekeeping, I think about my kids. And I want you guys to know before I tell you this story that this story costs me something. Every time I tell a story about my kids, I have to get permission, I have to pay them. So 2 stories. My daughter gets 2 stories, which is $2. She tried to make it 5 this morning, but it's 2. But I think about my kids. So, like I said, their birthday's in 2 weeks. My daughter's 6, about to be 7. She is empathetic. She is compassionate. She is gracious. She gets awards at school for being kind. I'm dead serious. She rocks. And my son is 3, and he is loud. End of the list. He's loud, and he's funny, and he falls a lot. His personality will develop over time. But here's the deal. When my kids are in conflict, my son gets loud, and my daughter gives in. Right? She literally said to us, and this is the sweetest thing, but also the wrong message we had to walk her through. She was like, "He's my brother. I'm just going to let him do what he wants." And I'm like, great thought, terrible application. Like, no, don't do that. He's a menace, right? So if I'm like, Caden, my son's name is Caden, Caden, you need to share with your sister, he'll, instead of being like, okay, or no, I want some more time, he'll go, ah! And then my sister, or his sister, Reagan, will go, it's okay. I don't even want it anymore. That's peacekeeping. That's not what Jesus is talking about. right? It's actively bringing peace into situations. Peacemaking is not the false proclamation of peace where there is none. We don't have to pretend conflict and division doesn't exist. We live in a fallen world. It's everywhere. But it's the active and costly work to promote and create peace in spaces of conflict and division, right? Think about it this way. Peacemakers build bridges, not walls. We build walls around ourselves to take care of us, to stay in our silo, to be just, hey, as long as my household is good, we're good, right? Like good fences make good neighbors, right? Let's live that way. But the reality is when we are peacemakers, we build bridges for other people. And Jesus says they will be called children of God because they emulate the God they serve. God in the Bible, Hebrews 13:20, is described as the God of peace because he brings peace to situations that don't have any. And we are called to do the same. Every believer is called to be a peacemaker, right? That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 when he talks about being ambassadors, representatives of Christ. He said, we have been given the ministry of reconciliation, which is making things right, which is bringing about peace. This is what we're all about. And in our context, we're often like, okay, well, like our political climate's terrible, so how do I make peace? But I want you to know that the political climate of Jesus' day was way worse. Let me describe it to you. Jesus' audience here is largely, I would say it's almost completely Jewish people. And this Jewish audience, they are living in a world that is rough. They are living in their ancestral land that is occupied by a military force from a government far, far away. They will never meet these people. And they're ruled by people who don't know their culture and don't care. And they have their military there to tell them what to do. And they're going to tell them how much money they have to pay in taxes. They're going to tell them the freedoms they have and don't have. They're going to tell them the parameters around worship even that they can have, right? This is their reality. So for this audience, peacemaking is different depending on the line of thinking you subscribe to here. There's four main ones. The first one is that of the Sadducees. And the Sadducees are these people, they're a religious elite, but they're not down with Jesus. So they think that keeping or making peace is killing Jesus. If they just kill Jesus, that's the conflict that we're dealing with. We'll get rid of Jesus, we'll be good. Right? Then there's this other group, the Pharisees. They are also religious elite, but they believe that making peace happen is all about keeping the Torah. If you keep the law, everything will work out okay. And then there's this third group. They're this separatists. They're the Essenes. And they think peacemaking is about withdrawing. Let's just go to the hills and hide. If we live in caves, Rome won't know where we are. That's peace, right? And then there's this fourth group, and they're the Zealots. They are going out of their way to make peace by force. Jesus, when he is before the crowd that says crucify him, the people call for a man named Barabbas. You may have heard that. And Barabbas was a zealot. He literally was very likely a murderer of Roman soldiers, thinking that's how you make peace. If you've read your Jewish history, which I'm not expecting you to have, and you've heard of something called the Maccabean revolts, this is literally the Jewish audience killing Roman soldiers, and this is what people think peace is about. Kill Jesus, kill the Romans, run away, or keep the Torah, and those are the ways to make peace. But Jesus introduces a fifth option, a better option, and his way to make peace is through self-sacrificial love. That is how Jesus will make peace. Jesus will live these Beatitudes. He will live out what it means to be a peacemaker, and he will suffer for it. So for us, what does it mean? We don't live in that context, right? So for us in our modern era, being a peacemaker is being people who actively seek reconciliation, justice, and the well-being of others in a way that reflects Christ-like humility and love. It is all about us seeking the betterment of those who are oppressed, who are suffering injustice, who can't help themselves, the powerless. So I want to give you a couple little more tangible examples because that feels very philosophy, theory type of idea. So I have a couple. The first one is an organization I work for called World Relief. This message is not brought to you by World Relief, but the gas to get here was. They pay me, but they're not paying me today, kind of a deal. World Relief is a humanitarian nonprofit. Here in the U.S., we do refugee resettlement. We work in the immigrant space, and a lot of times, people who come legally, and we work with people who are invited to the U.S. or are here legally, and we are helping them escape chaos. Right? A lot of times when people resettle here, especially as refugees, you might not know that they've fled their home country, that they've lived in a refugee camp that the UN is sponsoring for up to 10 to 15 years on average, right? And then they go through a 2 to 3 year vetting process, and then they arrive at the airport at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night with 2 duffel bags and no idea who's meeting them there. And our organization walks in and we create peace. And we take them to where they're staying that night, and they have a little food there that's culturally appropriate, and we leave. And we let them just have a night of peace. And then we get them established on earth. We use the resources that we have. We use the influence that we have to create peace for others. This is what it means to be a peacemaker. I think of my friend Timatape. He and I go back about 10, 11 years. His wife was the maid of honor in my wedding, and my wife was the maid of honor in his wedding. So husbands, you know, when the wives are best friends, the husbands also have to like each other. It's the rules. Luckily, I really like him. And he is a worship artist from Nashville. And he uses peace by using his social media platform, which has a decent following, and giving people information about what God is calling them to in the racial reconciliation space. As a black man, he walks those spaces, and he's not walking to make you feel guilty. He's walking to inform you what you might not know and tell you about the experience he has had. This is how you make peace. You use your influence for good. You enter arenas of division and you create peace. This is what it means to be a peacemaker, but Jesus is not naive. He knows that when you enter division and conflict, it's likely you're going to suffer for it. So he says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Once again, let's get back to the simplest terms. What is persecution? Persecution is systematic oppression and harassment, generally resulting in physical and emotional suffering. And notice, Jesus ties being persecuted to being poor in spirit or powerless, because if you were powerful, you wouldn't be persecuted. You would escape that, right? And so Jesus ties those things together. And he wants to do that on purpose. Like, Jesus is very methodical in his speech. Like, Jesus didn't wing it up there, you know what I mean? Because here's the deal. Persecution for the sake of righteousness is to be expected. He says, poor in spirit. He says, those who mourn. He says, blessed are those who are meek. And then he gets into this idea of things you do. And he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. And when you live that way, you suffer. You face persecution. Why? Because pushing back on the status quo will always result in pushback. Going against the grain is hard. Right? John Stott says it this way: persecution is simply the clash between two irreconcilable value systems. And the value system of our culture and the value system of the kingdom of heaven are very different. Which means when you identify that the kingdom of heaven is the value system you want and you try to live that out, expect it not to be easy. Sometimes we're like, Jesus, why isn't life following you easy? He said, I told you it wouldn't be. He says it all over the place. If they hate you, they hated me first, he says. This is what it's like to live these out. You're gonna face it, but here's what I want you to remember, and this is really important to me, because I think sometimes we misidentify things as persecution. Generally speaking, here in the States, we are not persecuted in the way Jesus is describing, right? There are Christians out there, and this sounds fake, but it's real, who fantasize about being persecuted. They long to be persecuted. There was a trend on TikTok. Are you guys on TikTok? Perfect. All shaking no's. So this will make, I'm hip. The youth left. They should have been here. There's this trend on TikTok where people would put up a caption that says when Christianity becomes illegal, and they'd play Locked Up by Akon and fake handcuff themselves, and they're like, I will stand for God. I'm like, you're in your living room. You're fantasizing. You're longing to be persecuted. Oh, I'm going to be so persecuted one day, but you're not. And to be frank with you, I'm passionate about this because that is disrespectful to people who are persecuted. When we're like, look at us. Like, no, dude, we don't live that. Right? Sometimes what we do is we point to the inconveniences and the realities of living as a human on earth, and we call them persecution. We say, the laws in my area don't reflect my values. You're like, that's what it means to be part of a human society. Sometimes you don't agree with everything, right? Or we say, people differ from me spiritually or politically. Right? That's just that's called diversity, right? I'm sorry your neighbor, has flags and signs for a candidate you don't like. But that's an opportunity. That's not persecution. And the third, it might be the most common one I hear, is I'm persecuted because there's a lot of comments in the media and on social media about Christians being hateful. Do you know why? Because the Christians they're talking about that are on the news are hateful. They hold signs with words we wouldn't even say out loud. And they point them in people's faces, and they tell people they're terrible, and they tell people that God hates them. And the reality is that is not the heart of God. That is people being hateful. Persecution is not the consequences of your actions. But for us, that's an opportunity to say, yes, that's a hurdle to jump, but my neighbor, by living out the way that God says to live here, the way that Jesus says we are to live in his kingdom, by living that out, we create opportunities to show people that it could be different. That it doesn't have to be that not everyone is that way, but it makes it harder, right? Christianity, right? Not this fake fantasizing about persecution, but Christianity, we come from a long line of people who have been persecuted. It was the reality for Jesus followers basically day one of this movement. Basically day one, persecution has been real, and it's been real ever since. I want to tell you a story. I tried to pick a story about an early Christian who was persecuted. I was spoiled for choice with how many people went through it for the sake of Christ, but I picked one. It's a woman in Carthage, North Africa in 203 AD named Perpetua, and I don't actually know if that's how you pronounce it, but that's what ChatGPT told me about pronouncing it, so we're going with it. Perpetua. And her story is really unique because she was actually of nobility in North Africa. And she became a Jesus follower, and she was arrested for it. And she was able, because of her noble status, to take a journal into the prison, and she journaled her experience. And she writes about her father, a nobleman, coming to her and pleading with her, Perpetua, you are ruining our family. You are breaking apart your marriage, and you are a mother to your kids. You need to recant Jesus following. And she won't do it. She says, this is something I'm willing to go through this for. And go through it she did. Thousands of people enter this amphitheater and watch her and hundreds of Christians be mauled by animals. And then soldiers would go around and finish the job. And the story goes that the soldier, this is an artist rendition, obviously, but the soldier comes up to her, shaking hand, not wanting to kill her, and she takes the sword and lifts it to her own neck, giving this guy permission to take her life because she is willing to suffer for Christ. That is the lineage of Jesus followers. That's why Jesus says, persecuted for righteousness. It's going to happen. But he says the good life belongs to those people. But it's because they will inherit the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven belongs to people who have gone through it. But persecution's not an old problem. It's an everyday current reality. It's estimated that more Christians today are facing persecution than ever before. These are statistics from Open Doors, pretty reputable source, and they do their best with the numbers. But here are some of the numbers. More than 380 million Christians face high levels of persecution and discrimination for their faith. They identify the top 50 nations for persecution. I believe 2 are in the Western Hemisphere. This is happening all over the place. Here's some examples. 1 in 7 persecuted worldwide. 1 in 5 in Africa. 2 in 5, 40% of Christians that live in Asia are persecuted. And they estimate that 4,476 Christians were killed for their faith last year. This is happening now. And because of the space I work in and the work I do, I get to hear stories. And I am blown away by the faith of these people. I think of one man who hosted a house church in Pakistan, and what they would do every week, because it was illegal to host a house church, what they would do every week is they would buy a birthday cake and put it in their fridge. That way, when the police came knocking, they would bust the birthday cake out. They'd pick someone in their church and be like, hey, it's your birthday today. And then the police would come in. They're like, this is just a birthday party, guys. I don't know what you're doing here. Genius, creative. He was arrested for his faith and faced all kinds of problems. He ended up being not released from prison, but sent away from the country. And he ended up in Redding, California. And he's a citizen that now lives in Sacramento, California, and he's crushing. I think of another pastor in my area who is from Iran, whose official charge when he was arrested is evangelism. This is official charge. The thing we're all terrified to do was his official charge. He spent a couple years in jail. He was moved to Turkey, where he spent some more time in jail. And now he is a pastor of an Iranian service in Sacramento because he decided my faith is more important than my freedom. My faith is more important than my safety. My faith is what drives me. And when I sat with him and heard his story, I'm like shaking, trying to like hold in the tears. And he's just like, it's okay. Like, I would do it again. This is the lineage of Jesus followers. This is what it means to be persecuted. And Jesus is clear that those who are persecuted are not persecuted in vain. Jesus is clear that I did not abandon them, and that's why they're going through it. Then he moves on. So this whole time, all these Beatitudes are like, blessed are the poor in spirit. It's this like theoretical person or group of people. And then he shifts his attention up from this theory down to the practical. And he says to his audience, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and speak all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. See, physical persecution, suffering physically for your faith, is a reality of these people. These people lived under Roman rule, and just, some 30 or so years after Jesus is presenting this message, Rome would largely burn to the ground. And historians agree that it was the Emperor Nero who did this because he loved architecture and he wanted to rebuild Rome. And when the people pointed fingers and said, you did this so you could rebuild Rome, he had to choose a scapegoat, so he chose the Christians. He said, no, it was the Christians who did it. And in 62 AD, they started a national persecution of Christians that lasted almost 300 years, where thousands of Christians were killed for their faith. This was a reality for Jesus' audience. His disciples are a case study in this, where of the 11 disciples, we know that 10 of them were martyred. They were killed for their faith, and one wasn't. His name is John. He was boiled alive and exiled. Pretty rough. Again, physical persecution was their reality, but he adds two more things. He adds this idea of slander, these insults and lies spoken about him, and that was inevitable too. Not just the Nero lie, but so many more. They were accused of cannibalism because of communion. Because Jesus said, take and eat, this is my body. And so the people were like, they're eating each other. No one did the research. You could just say anything, right? Also, communion services in that time were called love feasts. And the reason they called them these love feasts is because Jesus did what he did out of a place of love. And so people identified those as love feasts and said, look at these horrendous people committing adultery, immoral. They were called revolutionary fanaticists because they believed that Jesus was coming back to establish a physical kingdom. They were right in part. They were accused of splitting families because when one became a believer and one didn't, generally there was a break. Paul even instructs, hey, if you're a believer and your spouse is not, you can let them leave, which sounds harsh, but he knows the reality that it could be dangerous for everybody, right? They were accused of treason because to say Jesus is Lord is to say Caesar, the emperor, is not. This was their reality. But Jesus says something, and it's one of those statements in the Bible that, like, when I read it, I'm like, oh, come on. He says, rejoice and be glad. Now, I don't know about you, but when someone slanders my name, I don't sit back and rejoice. Do you? I don't double down on rejoicing, and I'm not rejoicing and glad. He's like, experience joy and be happy about it. Double down. I don't do that. So Jesus, what do you mean? It's the same thing that James says when he says, consider it pure joy when you go through trials. And we're like, James, be quiet. That's not good, right? So how can we rejoice and be glad? Jesus gives two reasons. I'm going to do these out of order. The first one is this. He says, you are linked with the prophets who were before you. Linked to the prophets. What he's saying is there is a long lineage of faithfulness in the face of persecution, and you are a part of it. The prophets spoke out against Israel on God's behalf, and oftentimes it led to them suffering. They were abused, they were rejected, they were often killed because they said, Israel, you kept a covenant, or you made a covenant, you have to keep it. And Israel's like, but I don't wanna, right? And we're like, pathetic, just keep your promise. And they don't. And so the prophets speak out, and they suffered for it. So he's saying you're linked with, it's the proof of your faith. You have a long line of people who went before you and were faithful. And the second, he says there is a reward awaiting you. Now, he's not saying if you're slandered today, you're going to go home and find like extra cash in your closet. It would be cool, but that's not what he's saying. He's saying there is a reward awaiting you. See, if you've read the end of the Bible, spoiler alert, don't want to alarm you how this ends. So if you've not read it, you can cover your ears. But at the end of the Bible, Jesus says, I'm coming to make all things new. And he's taking the reality of the Garden of Eden where he was with the people, and he's going to make that their reality again. He is coming to make all things new, to establish his kingdom on earth. That is a promise you can take to the bank. So when he says, great is your reward, he's saying in the future, when I make all things new, you're going to get to experience that. That's your reward. That is why your reward is great in heaven. Tim Mackey of the Bible Project tells us, and I love this idea, he says that the way we invest in that, the way we really get to experience this future is through our day-to-day work. This is what he says. Your day-to-day work is the arena where you invest in this new creation. The things that you're working on now can remain in this new reality. But in order for that to be the case, there has to be something that is of the nature of this new reality. So what he's saying is, you invest in what Jesus is coming to bring when you live out the values of the kingdom he's coming to establish. What are those values? He just told us. The good life belongs to people who live this out. Right? And here's the thing. He's saying your day-to-day work. So let me just break this down. If you work in an office, let me ease your mind. Your spreadsheets are not what he's talking about. Praise. The emails you have to get to after 2 weeks of vacation that you just mostly delete, that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is how do you treat people? What's the community that you've built around you like? How do you bestow honor on people that don't generally receive honor? How do you care for the vulnerable? How do you care for the oppressed? How do you seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God? When you do those things, you are investing in this new creation reality that he is coming to bring. And like I said, the way you know you're doing that is if your life is described as the Beatitudes describe it. Here's the thing with the Beatitudes. They are difficult to live out. I am not coming here to lie to you. They are difficult to live out, and we don't get to pick and choose. Man, we love to pick and choose in Scripture. We read something, it's like, love your enemies. You're like, no, let me find where God has plans for me, right? We love to pick and choose. We don't get to pick and choose at the Beatitudes. We are called to be peacemakers. We are called to hunger and thirst for righteousness. We're called to extend mercy, even when you don't want to. This is our calling. Why? Because we belong to the kingdom of heaven. And as Tim Mackey says, the kingdom of the skies represents a new kind of society where generosity, justice, and peace reign. It is a world where love is the final word. Does that describe your life? And we look to these Beatitudes and their difficulty and we go, but I can't do that. That's the point. See, in the kingdom of heaven, belonging to God is way more important than behaving better for God. What I mean by that is Jesus doesn't expect you to be good at these. He expects you to walk with him, to do life with him, and that is how you exude these things. We don't make effort to be perfect. We make effort to emulate Jesus, who is perfect, right? This is a process. You are in progress. I am in progress. We don't have to have this perfect. And praise God, because I don't. Maybe you do. I don't. So if we want to do this, if we want to live this out, walk the difficult path of the kingdom, if we want to enter arenas of conflict as peacemakers and invest in the new creation reality of the kingdom, like I said, how do we do that? I want to give you 3 really practical things that you can do this week to live this out. Number 1, let me just preface this. They're practical, they're not easy. Number 1 is choose forgiveness. Choose forgiveness. And you're like, Philip, you don't know what that person did to me. You don't know how they hurt me. You don't know how they stabbed me in the back. And let me tell you, you're right, I don't. Here's what I know though. When we don't forgive, we put ourselves in a place we don't belong. If you read Genesis in chapter 50, you come to the climax of the Joseph story. Joseph is beat up and sold into slavery by his brothers. Let me tell you, my brother beat me up a little bit when I was growing up, but never sold me, which is good. Maybe I should thank him today. He's sold into slavery and his dad dies, and his brothers are convinced that the only reason he hasn't killed them is because his dad was alive. So when their dad dies, they go to Joseph and they lie to him and they say, Dad said you have to forgive us. They don't apologize. And what does Joseph say? It's such an interesting verse. He says, am I in the place of God? He's like, I put myself on the throne when I try to determine who deserves my forgiveness. Right? And let me be clear. Forgiveness is not subjection to further abuse. If that's the situation, forgive, walk away. But forgiving hurts you. Right? There's the old adage, forgiveness is like eating rat poison and expecting the person that hurt you to be punished for it. Doesn't make sense. Or withholding forgiveness, I should say. Right? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who suffered under the Nazi regime for trying to help the Jews that were being persecuted, says this, in forgiving, we give away our own claims on justice, surrendering them to God who alone judges justly. Choose forgiveness. Number 2, pray and advocate for the persecuted. I didn't share all those numbers with you just so you would feel like womp womp, the service was sad today. I shared that so you can know there's a real reality of persecution that you can step into the gap and pray for. But also advocate for. Also use your voice. Find an organization you trust and invest. Let me just tell you, your church partners with World Relief, not Sacramento, Modesto. It's fine. It's fine. There's a territory thing. I wasn't allowed to steal you guys. It's fine. But the reality is your church is investing. So when you invest here, you invest in the new creation reality through organizations like World Relief and When I Grow Up. That is how you can invest. But if you want to do your own thing, find an organization you trust, give them your lunch money once a week, and support them. Pray for them. Pray for the persecuted church. They need it. And so often it's not in our backyard, so we don't think about it. This is what author Richard Wurmbrand says. I was going to try to summarize it, and I was like, no, he said it good. That's why he wrote a book. This is what he said. I tremble because of my own weakness, but I also tremble at the thought that the world could go on its way and not know or care about the suffering of the persecuted church. What a shame for us who go, well, it's not our reality. I'm good. We can pray and advocate. And the last piece is this: bring peace to people and bring people to peace. What does this mean? Number 1, bring peace to people. Use your influence to step into areas of division and conflict and promote the new creation reality that Jesus laid out. Seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly, hunger and thirst for righteousness, right? Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. This is how you and I can be peacemakers. But then the other piece is bring people to peace. The peace you as a Jesus follower know that is available to all people because of the sacrifice of Jesus. Where Jesus, looking at humanity rejecting him, says, I'm still going to come and self-sacrificially love them to the point of death. Right? And that's why Paul in Romans 5:8 says, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this, while we were still sinners, while we were actively rejecting God, Christ died for us. Give people that message of hope. Listen, you don't bring peace. You don't. I go to therapy. My therapist oftentimes doesn't make me feel peace. She stresses me out a little bit more. That's what people do. We stress each other out. When we think we're the answer, we're not. But we know who is. We know the peace that Paul describes as not able to comprehend. Bring people to that. Give people that message. Introduce them to hope, and hope is the person of Jesus. Life in the kingdom is hard. None of this is easy. But Jesus promises, I am with you. Rest in that. Can I pray for you? God, we are so thankful that you invite us into not just relationship with you, but you invite us into the reality of your kingdom to be a part of what you are creating here and now. And God, I pray that as we go this week, God, that you would give us the strength and the opportunity to be peacemakers, the strength and the opportunity to trust you, the strength and the opportunity to walk into conflict, promote peace, bring about peace, and be willing to pay some pushback for it. God, we thank you. Your presence isn't something we long for. It's something we experience. God, give us your spirit this week as we try to live out this the best we know how. In your name we pray. Amen.